800,000 men. That is the number now circulating through Ukrainian intelligence channels, through Russian military bloggers, and through the quiet corridors of regional administration buildings across Russia. Not as a headline Putin will read out on television, not as a decree with his signature stamped at the bottom for the world to see, but as an order, whispered down through the regions to fill a gap that Russia's war machine can no longer fill on its own. And in the same week this number began leaking out, something else happened that most people barely noticed. Russia quietly shut down its northern border crossings. 7 checkpoints, no explanation given. No date for reopening. 2 events, arriving almost side by side, and neither one officially confirmed by the Kremlin. But put them together, and a very different picture starts to emerge, one of a regime preparing for something it refuses to name. Before we go further into how this operation is being built and why the border closures matter far more than they first appeared to, it's worth pausing for a second. Independent war and geopolitics analysis like this tends to get buried by the algorithm, and a lot of people who would want to see it simply never do. If you find this useful, a like, a subscribe, and even a one-line comment genuinely helps this reach further. Now, let's get into it. The claim about the 800,000 figure did not come from a Kremlin press release. It came from Ukrainian sources with direct visibility into Russian military planning, most notably a former Ukrainian Interior Ministry advisor who has tracked Russian mobilization patterns since the war began. According to these sources, regional administrations across Russia have received informal instructions to prepare for a recruitment push on a scale that dwarfs anything seen since the chaotic mobilization of September 2022. But this time, the method is different. There will be no televised address, no presidential decree read out to the nation. Instead, men will reportedly be stopped in the street, pulled aside at workplaces, approached inside universities and technical colleges, and pressured into signing military contracts on the spot. Ukrainian sources describe a mechanism that skips the medical examination entirely, citing legislation already in place that permits this and skips training altogether. In plain terms, that means men pulled off the street this autumn could, in theory, be moved toward the front with no medical clearance and no meaningful preparation. If accurate, this would not be an army being built. It would be raw manpower being fed into a machine that has already burned through hundreds of thousands of men before them. To understand why Moscow would even consider something this reckless, you have to look at the numbers coming out of its own contract recruitment system, the one it has relied on for the last 3 years, specifically to avoid another chaotic mobilization. In the final quarter of 2025, the pace of new contract signings fell by roughly 1.5 times compared to the same period a year earlier. By the first quarter of 2026, the daily rate of new contracts had dropped to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people a day, around 20% lower than the same point in the previous year. According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, Russia had set a target of just over 200,000 new contract soldiers for the first half of 2026. It managed to sign roughly 195,000, a shortfall of close to 10,000 against its own goal. That gap might sound small in isolation, but it sits on top of a much bigger, much darker number. The same intelligence assessment estimated that Russia's personnel losses for 2026 alone had already reached nearly 197,000, including more than 115,000 killed or missing and over 80,000 wounded. The Center for Strategic and International Studies had separately estimated that by the end of 2025, Russia's total battlefield casualties since the invasion began had crossed 2 million, with as many as 325,000 of those killed. A German researcher tracking Russian federal budget disbursements has put the current pace of Russian deaths at roughly 9,000 men a month through 2026. That means for every 3 men, Russia is losing every month and is only managing to recruit enough to replace roughly 1 of them through paid contracts alone. This is the arithmetic Moscow is quietly running behind closed doors, and it is arithmetic that does not work. Russia needs somewhere close to 30,000 new soldiers every single month simply to keep its frontline numbers from shrinking. One anonymous Russian general speaking to journalists earlier this year put the real figure needed to actually capture the remaining Ukrainian-held territory in Donbass at 55 to 60,000 replacements a month, a number he himself admitted was almost impossible to sustain. His own explanation for setting a target that high was almost cynical in its honesty. By demanding a level of manpower nobody can realistically deliver, the general staff protects itself in advance. If the offensive stalls, the blame falls on a resource shortage rather than on strategy or competence. It is a system built to fail safely for the people at the top, even as it fails catastrophically for the men sent to the front. So Moscow has been throwing money at the problem instead of admitting the shortfall out loud. Contract signing bonuses in Moscow alone have climbed as high as 5.5 million rubles, more than $70,000, for a single year of service. In some of the country's poorer regions, according to Western estimates, total compensation packages have been advertised at figures approaching $80,000, staggering sums in a country where the median salary sits nowhere close to that. Billboards across Western Moscow now openly advertise these figures to passers-by, a war economy selling itself to its own population like a lottery ticket. But even this scale of financial incentive is losing its pull. Recruitment across Moscow and the country as a whole has fallen by roughly a third this year compared to 2025, according to independent Russian outlets tracking military enlistment data. The pool of men willing to risk their lives for a payout, however large, is shrinking. And that is precisely the moment at which a state that has spent 3 years avoiding the word mobilization starts looking for other ways to fill the gap without ever using that word again. This is where the border closures come back into the picture, and why the timing deserves far more attention than it has received. On the 1st of July, Russia's government quietly suspended all rail traffic through 7 checkpoints along its northwestern frontier. 5 of them sit on the border with Finland, including the crossing at Vyborg, historically one of the busiest transit points between Russia and the European Union. 1 crossing on the Estonian border and 1 on the Latvian border were shut down alongside them. No explanation was given. The decree signed by the Prime Minister simply stated that movement of people, vehicles, goods, and cargo through these specific checkpoints was being temporarily suspended, with no date attached for when that suspension might end. Russia's foreign ministry was instructed only to notify the 3 neighboring governments, not to justify the decision to them. For Finland specifically, this closure means it now has no working rail crossing left with Russia at all, a country that shares a border stretching over 1,300 kilometers, the longest of any European Union member state. On its own, a quiet administrative closure of a handful of railway checkpoints might seem like a minor bureaucratic footnote in a war that has produced far louder headlines. But context changes everything here. Back in September of 2022, when Putin announced his first and only mobilization to date, it was precisely these northern land routes into Finland and the crossings into Georgia that filled with traffic within hours, as hundreds of thousands of Russian men of fighting age raced for the exits before the borders could be sealed behind them. Finland eventually shut its own side of the border in response to a wave of arrivals, and by late 2023 had closed nearly every road crossing indefinitely. What Russia has now done is close its own side of the remaining rail arteries first, before any public announcement of a new call-up, rather than after one. Analysts covering the region have openly asked the obvious question, is this Moscow learning from its own mistake, moving to seal the exits in advance this time, precisely because it expects the same panic to repeat itself the moment men start receiving contracts they did not ask to sign? A quick pause here, because if you're finding this breakdown useful, dropping a comment with your own read on where this is heading helps this analysis reach more people who are trying to make sense of the same headlines. Let's keep going, because the legal machinery behind all of this is just as important as the numbers. Here is something most casual observers miss entirely. Russia never formally closed the legal door it opened in September 2022. The presidential decree that authorized the original partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists remains, according to legal experts tracking Russian military law, still technically active. It was never repealed, never given a formal end date. What this means in practice is significant. The Kremlin does not need a new nationwide address to the country, does not need another dramatic television moment to expand the call-up. A legal expert with the Russian human rights group Citizen Army Law has pointed out that the authorities could simply issue a separate and possibly secret presidential order instructing the defense ministry to summon an additional number of people under the umbrella of a mobilization order that, on paper, never ended. Such an order would not even need to be made public. It could operate entirely behind the machinery of the state, invisible to ordinary Russians until the summons arrives at their own door. And the state has spent the last several years quietly building exactly the kind of machinery such a covert expansion would require. Since 2022, Russia has rolled out an electronic military registration database that did not exist in its current form when the first mobilization descended into chaos. Draft notices, once delivered by hand and easy to dodge simply by not answering the door, can now be issued electronically and are considered legally served the moment they appear in a citizen's government account, whether that citizen has opened it or not. New rules require employers to report which of their staff are eligible for military service. And as of this year, under a decree signed at the end of December 2025, Russia moved away from its old system of 2 separate seasonal drafts toward a single, continuous, year-round conscription framework, with a formal target of 261,000 conscripts set for the whole of 2026. Draft offices can now issue summonses, conduct medical exams, and convene draft commissions at any point across the calendar, not just during 2 narrow springtime and autumn windows. The bureaucratic scaffolding for a much larger, much less visible mobilization is already standing. All that is missing is the political decision to use it at scale. That decision appears to already be circulating at senior levels, even if Moscow keeps denying it publicly. In June of this year, a Russian parliamentary deputy and former member of the Duma's Defense Committee stated openly in a message to his followers that informed people close to the process, had told him a fundamental decision had already been made to carry out a new large-scale mobilization this autumn, driven by the stalled winter and spring offensives and by the accumulating losses on the front. Around the same time, Ukraine's own president said publicly that his country had taken note of Russian plans to mobilize around 100,000 additional troops, and that Ukraine was reinforcing positions in the Chernihiv and Kyiv sector as a precaution. A month later, the head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation went further, saying Russia was preparing an autumn mobilization of 500,000 personnel, with part of that number rushed to the Eastern Front within 2 weeks, and the rest given roughly a month of training in preparation for a possible new offensive axis. The Kremlin's official response to all of this, when pressed, has been a flat denial that any new draft campaign is being planned. But sources close to the presidential administration, speaking to independent Russian outlets, have told a different story, describing internal discussions over several different, quieter roadmaps for expanding the army's manpower, with one source suggesting that whatever decision is made will likely surface only after September, once the country's parliamentary elections are safely out of the way. That timing detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire picture. September 2026 brings Duma elections, and the Kremlin, whatever its internal panic over manpower, understands exactly how politically toxic another chaotic mobilization would be if it landed in the middle of a campaign season. The last one triggered the largest single exodus of people from Russia since the 1917 revolution, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million citizens fleeing across every open border within weeks, disproportionately young, urban, and university-educated, stripping the country of exactly the demographic it can least afford to lose twice. Rare public protests broke out in cities that had stayed silent for the first 7 months of the war, and the men who did not flee, the roughly 300,000 who were actually swept up into uniform during that first mobilization, have not fared much better than the country's reputation abroad. Western intelligence estimates now suggest that fewer than 78,000 of those original 300,000 mobilized men remain alive and fit for frontline duty today. The rest have been killed, wounded, captured, or have simply walked away from their units. Desertion has become its own quiet crisis inside the Russian military, with some Western analytical groups estimating that as many as 70,000 soldiers could desert from the Russian army in a single year alone, driven by exhaustion, unofficial extensions of service with no clear path home, and the psychological toll of watching entire assault groups get wiped out for a few hundred meters of contested ground. So when Russian officials insist that this new wave, if it comes, will be nothing like 2022, that reassurance comes from a government that has already run this exact experiment once, watched a third of the country's most capable young population try to leave overnight, and still lost the vast majority of the men it did manage to keep. The Kremlin has spent 3 years actively engineering its recruitment system specifically to avoid repeating that scene. Which is exactly why, if this new wave does happen, it is being built to look like anything except mobilization. Individual contracts, regional quotas, street pressure, electronic paperwork nobody sees until it's too late to leave, a mobilization with no name, so that no single dramatic moment exists for the public to rally against. There's a demographic clock running underneath all of this, too, one that makes every one of these numbers heavier than it first appears. Russia entered this war with a population already aging and already shrinking, the long-term legacy of the collapse of the 1990s still working its way through the country's birth statistics 3 decades later, pulling hundreds of thousands more men out of the workforce, on top of the roughly 1 million who left the country in 2022, and the hundreds of thousands who have been killed or permanently maimed since, does not just cost Russia soldiers. It costs Russia workers, taxpayers, and fathers in a country where the working-age population was already projected to contract for years to come before a single shot was fired in Ukraine. Every additional wave of mobilization borrows more heavily against a demographic future that was already fragile, trading tomorrow's economy for today's front line in a way that no signing bonus can ever fully repay. The human cost of this quieter approach is already visible if you know where to look. University campuses have become one of the most aggressive recruitment fronts this year. Students have reportedly faced growing pressure to sign contracts with the country's expanding drone units, with some who failed their winter examinations offered a military contract as an alternative to expulsion, effectively converting academic failure into a pipeline toward the front. The Defense Ministry has, according to reporting inside Russia, set informal recruitment quotas for universities, treating campuses as a manpower resource to be harvested rather than a population to be protected from the war. Migrants, people in financial hardship, and the homeless have also become frequent targets of similar pressure campaigns, according to human rights monitors tracking recruitment practices. In the Penza region, in June, Security forces and military enlistment officers reportedly carried out coordinated street raids, detaining local men and pressuring them into signing contracts on the spot. A preview, perhaps, of exactly what an 800,000-man campaign without formal mobilization would look like scaled up across the entire country. It's worth asking the obvious question here. If Russia genuinely believes it can add anywhere close to this many men to its fighting force, would it actually change anything on the battlefield? The uncomfortable answer, according to military analysts studying the war closely, is probably not as much as the Kremlin needs it to. One Russian military analyst who has tracked recruitment and battlefield data throughout the war has pointed out that Russia's core problem right now isn't simply a shortage of bodies. It's a shortage of the command structures, trained officers, and equipment needed to turn raw recruits into units capable of operating effectively. A wave of new mobilized men could be used to stand up additional reserve regiments relatively quickly on paper, but those units, thrown together without proper training or experienced leadership, would struggle to function as a coherent fighting force. Simply inflating the headcount of the military does not translate into a comparable rise in combat effectiveness, and in a war increasingly shaped by drone reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and precision strikes on high-value targets like trained operators, quantity without quality can become a liability as easily as an asset. There's also a brutal financial reality underneath all of this. A mobilized force on the scale being discussed would require payments comparable to what mobilized troops received back in 2022, and both federal and regional budgets in Russia are already under serious strain from 3.5 years of war spending. Throwing 800,000 more names onto the payroll of a state already running significant deficits is not a decision made lightly, however much the front line may be demanding it. And yet, the geopolitical stakes of this potential wave stretch well beyond the trenches of eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian sources tracking the plan have specifically warned that any large new intake of men could be used not only to replenish existing frontline units, but to reinforce and expand military districts that sit much closer to NATO's eastern flank, and potentially to stand up entirely new ones. This is not a hypothetical concern invented for dramatic effect. Russia has already been quietly rebuilding its military presence along its northwestern border over the past 2 years. The Leningrad military district, carved out of the old Western military district specifically in response to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, held only around 30,000 troops before the invasion of Ukraine began. Current planning documents reviewed by regional defense analysts suggest that number could climb toward 100,000, accompanied by several hundred main battle tanks, alongside a newly forming army corps in Karelia, expected to add another 15,000 troops close to the Finnish frontier. Russia and Belarus are also planning to hold their large-scale Zapad joint military exercises this year, a series that has historically served more than once as cover for troop movements that outlasted the exercise itself. Finland's own defense minister has said publicly that his country understands exactly what these preparations represent and is adjusting its own defenses accordingly. Finland alone can mobilize close to 280,000 of its own men in fields, what is widely regarded as the most powerful artillery force in Europe. A reminder that whatever Moscow is planning along this frontier would not go unanswered. History gives this particular detail extra weight. The last time Russia and Belarus staged their joint Zapad exercises at full scale in 2021, the drill involved more than 200,000 personnel, and served, in hindsight, as one of the clearest warning signs of the buildup that led directly into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine just months later. Nordic and Baltic intelligence services have also spent the last 2 years documenting a steady rise in hybrid activity well beyond conventional troop numbers, unexplained damage to undersea cables, sabotage attempts against transport and energy infrastructure, and the recruitment of local criminal networks to carry out low-level disruption on Russia's behalf. None of this proves that a new mobilization wave is being built specifically to threaten NATO's northern flank, rather than simply to replace losses in Ukraine. But it does mean that anyone reading the words new military districts and reinforced formations in the same sentence as Finland and the Baltic states is not reaching for a worst-case scenario out of nowhere. Regional defense planners have already spent 2 years preparing for exactly this possibility. There's also a quieter economic story running underneath all of this, one that makes the choice to mobilize even harder for the Kremlin to justify to itself. 3.5 years of war spending has already pulled Russia's labor market badly out of shape. Defense factories, flush with state contracts, have been offering wages so far above the civilian market rate that ordinary businesses have been forced to raise their own salaries just to stop workers walking out the door. A distortion economists sometimes call Dutch disease, where one overheated sector drags the whole economy toward imbalance. Average monthly wages across the country have climbed sharply since the invasion began, but productivity has not kept pace with that climb, leaving many civilian employers unprofitable even as they pay more than ever. Layer a mobilization of 800,000 additional men on top of that, each one requiring payments comparable to what mobilized troops received back in 2022. And you are not just asking for bodies. You are asking regional and federal budgets already running under serious strain to absorb a wage bill on a scale the country has never had to carry before. At the exact moment its oil and gas revenues, the backbone of that budget, have been sliding. It is precisely this tension between a front line that is bleeding faster than it can be replaced and a treasury that cannot comfortably pay for the replacement that is pushing the Kremlin toward the quiet, deniable version of mobilization rather than the loud one. Contracts can be framed as voluntary. A secret supplementary order can be framed as routine administration. A formally declared second mobilization cannot be framed as anything other than what it is, and that is the one outcome the Kremlin appears determined to avoid at almost any cost. Before we get to how Ukraine and NATO's eastern flank are actually reading all of this, it's worth taking a second again. If this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown is useful to you, hitting like and leaving even a short comment with your own prediction genuinely helps push this past the algorithm and in front of more people trying to follow this war closely. Now, back to the border. Put all of these threads together and a single coherent shape starts to emerge from what otherwise looks like a scattering of unconnected headlines. A recruitment system that is visibly failing to keep pace with the rate of Russian losses on the battlefield. A leaked plan, sourced to Ukrainian intelligence circles but consistent with independent Russian reporting, to quietly summon up to 800,000 men through street pressure and contract coercion rather than a formal decree. A legal and digital infrastructure built patiently over the last 3 years, specifically designed to make that kind of quiet expansion possible without a single dramatic announcement. A set of border closures on the northern frontier that, whether coincidental or deliberate, mirror almost exactly the routes that carried hundreds of thousands of frightened men out of the country the last time a mobilization was announced. And a political calendar with September elections looming that gives the Kremlin every incentive to keep denying all of it right up until the moment the votes are counted. None of this guarantees that a wave on the scale of 800,000 men will actually materialize exactly as described. Kremlin officials continue to deny any new draft campaign is being planned. And some Russian military analysts remain genuinely skeptical that Moscow, even in its current state of desperation, would risk the political fallout of anything resembling the scale of 2022 before an election. It is entirely possible that what unfolds instead is something narrower, a series of quieter, regionally targeted pushes dressed up as ordinary contract recruitment, using exactly the legal tools already built for that purpose, rather than one dramatic nationwide wave. But the direction of travel is difficult to argue with. The math of replacing 9,000 deaths a month with barely a third that many new contracts does not resolve itself. The pressure inside the system, from a stalling offensive, from a Donbass campaign that by the military's own admission cannot be completed without tens of thousands more men every single month, from a general staff that has learned to demand the impossible simply to protect itself from blame, has to go somewhere. A state that has spent 3 years perfecting every tool required to mobilize quietly, without ever using the word mobilization again, is not building that machinery for no reason. There is an old pattern in how struggling powers behave when the front cannot be sustained by volunteers anymore. They rarely announce the crisis outright. They rename it. A call-up becomes a contract campaign. A closed border becomes a temporary suspension. A second mobilization becomes several 100,000 individual, unconnected decisions, each one small enough to deny, each one designed so that no single moment exists for a country to see clearly what is actually happening to it, until the paperwork has already reached far more doorsteps than anyone expected. Whether that pattern is unfolding right now along Russia's northern frontier, or whether this remains, for now, an unconfirmed and possibly exaggerated warning from a government at war with Moscow, is something only the coming weeks will settle. But the sheer number of independent threads now pointing in the same direction, the recruitment collapse, the digital machinery, the quietly closed checkpoints, the election calendar being watched just as closely in Kiev as it is in the Kremlin, makes this a story worth watching closely rather than dismissing. Kiev, for its part, is not waiting to find out which version of this story turns out to be true. Ukrainian forces have spent recent months expanding a long-range strike campaign aimed squarely at the infrastructure any large mobilization would depend on. Refineries that keep military vehicles fueled, rail junctions that move new recruits toward training grounds, and depots that would need to arm and equip several 100,000 additional men on short notice. That campaign is not simply about degrading the front line in the here and now. It is a direct bet that the fastest way to blunt a mobilization wave before it even reaches the trenches is to make sure the system receiving all those new names cannot actually clothe, arm, train, or transport them at the scale being promised. Every strike on a rail hub or a fuel depot is, in effect, a strike on the logistics of 800,000 men who do not exist as soldiers yet, only as names on regional lists. It is a quieter front in this war, but arguably one of the most consequential, because a mobilization that cannot be equipped is not an army. It is simply a larger number of people standing in the same broken supply lines that have already failed the men currently on the front line. And that, in the end, is the real story sitting underneath the number 800,000. Not just whether Russia can find that many men willing or unwilling to sign, but whether a state that cannot feed its refineries, cannot keep its recruitment offices honest, and cannot even publicly admit it is running short of soldiers, has the capacity to turn that many names into an actual fighting force. Empires and regimes under strain rarely collapse the moment they run out of manpower. They start to crack the moment the gap between what they claim and what they can actually deliver becomes impossible to hide, even from their own citizens, standing in a queue at a rail crossing that used to lead somewhere, and now simply leads to a locked gate with no explanation attached. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If Russia does move ahead with a call-up on anything close to this scale, dressed up as contracts rather than conscription, do you think it changes the course of the war in any meaningful way? Or does it simply repeat 2022 on a larger, quieter scale, more men lost, more citizens fleeing, and the same battlefield deadlock waiting on the other side of it? Share your take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of story where the next few weeks are going to matter far more than the last few months. And if you want to keep following how this develops, subscribing and turning on notifications means you won't miss the moment this either gets confirmed or quietly buried.